So our honors presenter is Elizabeth Carls, and I had the pleasure of working with her in the senior honors seminar in the fall. And she is going to be presenting on non-classroom staff in Texas public schools, and she's been working with Professor Carolyn Huxby in the economics department.
Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elizabeth. My advisor, as Professor Sprague mentioned, is Professor Caroline Huxby. And I'd like to talk to you today about the variation in non-classroom staff. So to dive in, I'd like you to think about what makes a school. Maybe you think about the students, or the teachers, the administrators, maybe even the auxiliary personnel like the lunch ladies and janitors. But there's a whole group of people who work in schools who most of us never consider. And these guys are non-classroom staff. So this is the personnel breakdown in all of Texas, in the Texas public school systems, which is the state whose data I use. And as you can see, in addition to teachers, administrators, and auxiliary personnel, there's educational aides and support staff. And together, these guys make up non-classroom staff. And they make up 20% of all of school personnel. And it turns out that non-classroom staff matter, not just because they make up that 20% that we saw, but also because they make up 15% of payroll, and because their numbers have been increasing consistently over the past 2 decades. This graph shows that non-classroom staff have grown at a rate of 46% as compared to teachers and students, which have had lower growth rates. Surprisingly though, there isn't very much research on non-classroom staff, and my thesis seeks to address this gap by answering 3 questions. The first question that I address is how much variation really is there in non-classroom staff? The second question is what does this variation imply for payroll and overall school expenditure? And my third question is what explains the variation in non-classroom staff? And I try different methodologies to explain that. The rest of this presentation will flow as follows. I'll talk briefly about my literature review, my data, my methodology and results, and then briefly discuss my findings and the conclusions based on it. To dive into the literature review, there are, as I mentioned, very few studies that touch on non-classroom staff. The bodies of work that do look at non-classroom staff are derived from two main bodies. The first study is the National Trends in Education Spending, and from that body of work, we have 2 conclusions. The first comes from a 1996 study by Hanushek and Rivkin, in which they disaggregated national school spending, and they find that, oh my goodness, non-classroom staff actually do make up a significant portion of our expenditure. However, this trend isn't really picked up again until 2012, in which a report by Scafidi and the graphs that we saw before shows the increase in non-classroom staff. The second body of literature that touches on non-classroom staff looks at the individual effectiveness of staff, and so they look at things like guidance counselors and special education. But for our purposes, it's really this first body of work that drives our analysis. Now let's look at data. I chose Texas because of its quality of data, essentially. Texas is very large, it has over 1,000 school districts, and it's diverse, racially, geographically, socioeconomically. In addition, it has very high quality administrative data that isn't really found in other states. To make my data set, I merged school level and district level data from a wide variety of sources. To look at results, I'd like to go question by question. So my first question is how much variation does exist in non-classroom staff? These graphs show the distribution of support staff per 100 students for both staff per 100 students for both support staff and educational aides on the school level. And what we see is that there is tremendous variation in the number of staff. So I know that these numbers are small, so I'll kind of read them off to you. Essentially, for a school at the 90th percentile, it employs 6 times as many support staff as a school at the 10th percentile. In addition, for educational aides, a school at the 90th percentile employs 13 times as many support staff as a school at the 10th percentile. So that tells us that there actually is huge variation in the number of staff that schools employ. That brings us to our second question, which is what does this mean for educational spending and payroll? And it turns out that here there is also a lot of variation. These graphs show the distribution of per student spending for support staff and educational aides now on the district level. I don't use the school level data simply because it doesn't exist. An average school will spend about $500 per student on support staff. However, a school at the 90th percentile will spend about $900 per student on support staff, whereas one at the 10th percentile will spend about $200. So it's a $700 difference in per student spending based on support staff. We see something similar in educational aides. A school at the, an average school will spend about $300 on educational aides. A school at the 90th percentile will spend about $400 on educational aides, whereas one at the 10th percentile will spend about $200. So again, that's a huge difference between the 90th and the 10th percentile, and shows that there is actually a lot of variation in how much schools are spending on non-classroom staff per student.
Just a quick question
Yeah.
on definition of educational aides are not in the classroom.
Yeah, so, okay, I actually, let me debrief you on what educational aides and support staff are. Educational aides are the ones helping the teachers in the classroom, and support staff are people who kind of perform other functions, like maybe they are guidance counselors or media specialists and curriculum specialists. They're generally student-facing, but they're not directly in the classroom. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and please do stop me if you have questions. So that brings us to our last question, which is, what can explain this variation? And I tried 3 different methods to explain it. My first hypothesis is that maybe the variation in non-classroom staff is driven by exogenous school and district characteristics. So those are the things that schools can't control. And if it is associated with that, then it means that schools are essentially reacting to their circumstances, and they react in a pretty uniform way. To test this, I run the following regression. I have my dependent variable as non-classroom staff to student ratio, and I have my independent variables include a polynomial for total students, a set of race dummies, a set of district demographics that include median household income, and the percent of the district that does not speak English very well, the district type, so are you urban, rural, suburban, etc., and the district education, so how many people have a high school education, how many people have a college education, etc. Actually, before I show you that, I'm about to show you a lot of numbers. And the reason that I do that is not so that you see what are significant, but actually so that you can see the amount of things that are not significant. Because that's really the takeaway from this regression, which is just how many characteristics don't explain the variation in non-classroom staff. So with that, we'll move into this. First we see, essentially, this is the result of 8 different regressions. And each regression has its own column. The first 4 columns are the dependent variable for the support staff to student ratio. The second 4 columns, the dependent variable is the aide to student ratio. And I've also broken it down by school type. What I've highlighted in blue are the variables that are consistently significant across all specifications. But I want you to focus instead on the variables highlighted in black, because those are the things that are kind of surprisingly uncorrelated. So notice that all of the race dummies, except for multiracial, don't really explain the variance. Neither do any of the urbanization variables, except for rural. More surprisingly, household income, nor percent of the district that speaks English, nor the education level really explains any of the variation either. And even when we look down here at the R squared, they're tiny. At most, 6% of the variation is explained by these variables. And so together this suggests 2 conclusions. The first is that very few of the exogenous characteristics really do explain the variance in non-classroom staff. And the second is, of those characteristics that are explanatory, they explain very little of the variation. So now we move on to a second explanation, which is, okay, maybe non-classroom staff are correlated with student achievement. The hypothesis being that if they are, well, the hypothesis being, if you have 2 schools that are identical on their observables, except for one has a higher test score and a higher non-classroom staff to student ratio, then maybe the test scores are somehow associated with the non-classroom staff. Maybe non-classroom staff are associated with a higher quality of school. To test that, I just modify my previous regression a little bit. I move the non-classroom staff to student ratio into an independent variable. And I move the test score on the Texas State Standardized Test as my dependent variable. My controls are as before. And what we find is actually, if anything, non-classroom staff are negatively correlated with test scores. So this might suggest maybe non-classroom staff are kind of like doctors, in the sense that doctors are found more in regions where there are sick patients. So maybe non-classroom staff are found in schools where there are more struggling students. That could be. The third explanation that I try is perhaps non-classroom staff are associated with an increase in revenue. So maybe as a school, I hire more non-classroom staff when my revenue increases. To test this, I exploit a change in the Texas school funding that occurred in 1993 to 1994, called Robin Hood. And what Robin Hood essentially did is that it reallocated tax dollars from property wealthy districts to property poor districts, such that the property poor districts felt an increase in revenue after Robin Hood compared to previous revenue levels. And specifically what I look at is the ratio of state aid to base year expenditure both before and after Robin Hood. What I find is that actually schools do feel an increase in revenue. So what this graph shows is this is 1990, this is 1996. And before Robin Hood, which happens around here, schools are getting about 50 cents to every dollar that they're spending on students from the state. After Robin Hood, we see that some schools are getting about 75 cents to a dollar for every dollar that they're spending on their students from the state. So that is a significant increase in revenue. However, we don't really see a corresponding increase in non-classroom staff. This graph shows the difference, the change in revenue versus the change in non-classroom staff. And if there were a positive relationship, we would expect that line to be tilted, to be positively slanted, but it's not. This is for support staff, and we see a very similar picture for educational aides, suggesting that schools actually aren't hiring more staff when their budgets increase. So this leaves us with a puzzle, but we've still found some interesting facts. The first is that there's actually huge variation in non-classroom staff, and it has very serious implications for payroll and overall school spending. However, it's not very easily explained, at least by the models that we've seen. And this suggests that there is something motivating that variation, but we can't see it. Maybe it's just that some schools are better managed than others, and maybe it's just that some schools are differently managed than others. However, either way, it suggests that if Texas could figure out what an efficient staffing model is, and it could incentivize local decision makers to adopt it, then it might be able to save significant amounts of money while keeping achievement constant. Thank you. Any questions?
Did you ever try a curvilinear relationship between income level and the ratios? Because I was just thinking that I could see for schools that maybe aren't that well funded, that they need a lot of people, English as second language, and people that need remedial help. But then maybe the really well funded ones are focusing on STEM specialists, curriculum specialists.
So you mean like have a polynomial on median household income?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't do that, but I see what you're saying. That's a great point. I think that when you graph it, when you just straight up graph it, there's kind of it's kind of just a cloud. But
Yeah, because if you graphed it, you would probably see some of that. So
yeah,
that's just the first thing.
yeah, no,
like
that's
how
I
would think it would maybe.
that it would be yeah.
It doesn't sound like this kind of data was available, but in any case, were you able to look at any subtypes of non-classroom staff? Because I would think that looking at where, the relative variation in the subgroups could potentially give you insights into, some of the factors that were contributing to the variation.
Yes, that actually is one of the things that was most frustrating to me, is that essentially, so you have your support staff and you have your educational aides. Your support staff have like maybe 50 different categories in them, and they do have like, they play super different roles. Educational aides is kind of just one function. The support staff are only disaggregated on the district level, and there aren't very many of them within a district, so that I don't think that you could tease out the variation fairly easily.
Mhm.
But if you were able to, that's kind of where that second body of literature comes in on testing, like, what is the effectiveness of a guidance counselor? What is the effectiveness of the special education staff? And that's kind of why that literature exists. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah.
Did you try and think about how to deal with the endogeneity on the test scores?
Yeah, so essentially, a lot of the analysis that we saw was actually came about from me trying to find an instrument to do exactly what you're saying. In addition to, I looked at so I was trying to do a regression discontinuity with Robinhood and seeing like, I assumed that there would be an increase in non-classroom staff, but I couldn't find it. And I also couldn't find when I looked at oil prices as well. Professor Hosby. So essentially, I couldn't get the causality for test scores, but that's what you would essentially want to answer. But interestingly, the causality is really weird for support staff because you don't know, it's like this weird aggregate of people who do different things, and you don't necessarily think that a school nurse is going to influence test scores. You know what I mean? So it's kind of shaky either way.
So I remember in fall quarter that we talked some about that some people felt that sometimes they demote people to the non-classroom staff.
Yeah.
Were you able to, I don't know if you ever did the interviews or able to find out anything about that theory?
So I did not do interviews. The one thing that would address that is that since there isn't an increase in non-classroom staff when budgets rise, that would kind of suggest that if there is systemic political or that there wouldn't be systemic political patronage. That doesn't mean I think that there is none of it, because it might not just happen when budgets rise, but that to me suggested that, okay, maybe it's not like I'm gonna hire my aunt, my uncle, and my cousins when my budget increases. Any other questions?
I'm sort of searching outside of the round of variables, excuse me, that you've used here in my devious way, and I'm just wondering if perhaps there's something here that wasn't captured by the scope of your study. The three things that come to my mind are, first of all, federal and state mandates that require additional personnel to carry out various laws, disability, for instance,
Yeah.
laws like that. Perhaps unrecognized. The second, of course, is school labor unions, teachers' unions, and possibly variations from district to district in terms of what teachers demand for classroom assistance, for instance. And then the third is just good old political corruption, that payroll padding that in certain places, I don't know how you'd measure something like this, but in certain places perhaps the local politicians do a little pushing of family and friends into the because let's face it, schools have always been a source of patronage and political favor.
Okay, so I want to address all of the points of your question. So the first is maybe there are other
Federal, state mandates.
Mm-hmm. The second is that maybe there are people doing kind of like special education things that aren't...
The influence of labor unions more generally.
Oh, okay, labor unions.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third is political patronage.
Mm-hmm.
So political patronage kind of ties to the question that Professor Sprague asked, which is that if anything was going to indicate political patronage, to me it would be that if the budget loosens, you hire more non-classroom staff. And since we don't see that, I think it's probably not systematic. Not saying that it doesn't happen, but at least it's not like open the floodgates. To address the question about the federal and state mandates, there's kind of two things that come to mind. The first is minimums, classroom minimums of like, you must have at least one guidance counselor for every high school. And we do see the impact of that. It's actually not in this slide, but there's a difference between what happens when you take population density versus the total students in a school. And you can see that the variable on total students is significant, such that it's essentially decreases kind of, I don't know, quadratically, suggesting that smaller schools have more staff. And so there is an influence of mandates of like minimums. The second thing is that there is there's an influence of like special education programs. So mandates of special education, you are gonna see in schools where they have more special education, there are gonna be more staff. The causality on that is kind of interesting, because do you classify more students as special education to hire more staff? Or do you hire more staff because you already have more special education students? We don't know. And then to answer your third question about labor unions, one of the interesting things about this is that these people aren't unionized like teachers. So with teachers, you would kind of expect to see, like there's a law that makes them kind of entrenched. For non-classroom staff, you could actually vary their numbers more because there isn't that like legal framework binding your hands, which is kind of makes it even more odd and fascinating that there is no way of explaining easily the variation. So, does that answer all of your
I
questions?
think you did a marvelous job. These are kind of ethereal questions in a way, but I think it's still valuable to address them outside,
Yeah.
outside the scope of your analysis.